About a year ago, my friend Ted was at a flea market in Central Florida, Renegers, and contacted me and asked me if I wanted him to pick up this Victrola motor, thinking that it might be a good motive force for an automaton. And so I said, sure, why don't you go ahead and grab it? And so he did. He bought this thing. The wood is roached. It's just the motor on the panel here. And when he got it back, he discovered that the mainspring was broken on this. And so he took the thing apart in his shop and rebuilt the spring can, took the whole thing apart, cleaned it, re-greased it. You can't believe what a project that was. And was able to repair the spring and get it all back together. And then he brought it over to me, and it's been sitting in my shop for just about a year now. So this thing is a good, strong running 1914 Victrola motor, and I think it'll be a great motive force for a project that I have in mind. So spent about 3 hours degreasing it in mineral spirits and going over it with wool. Tore it down as far as I dared. I didn't want to take out this spur here. It's pinned to its cross shaft. And also I couldn't get this worm gear out here that drives the record spindle here. This bronze gear, I pulled the set screw out and it's just absolutely stuck to the shaft. So I couldn't get that apart. I was afraid of damaging it, so I just kind of cleaned it in place as best I could. But I took the fly ball governor and took that apart, every little piece, and cleaned it up. And I was just so impressed with brass, all the brass fittings and the tiny little screws. I mean, it's like a piece of clockwork, and it just absolutely went back together perfectly. And so here it is. You just take a couple of little twists of the spindle, and this thing will go for quite some time just on the inertia of those little fly balls. So I'm just kind of in love with this little mechanism here. So you can see it going to its maximum speed setting here. It only goes so far, and then as it winds down, you can see the balls coming back in, and the spindle slows. Isn't that beautiful? Well, I've got it back together. I wound it up here, and you got to give it a little nudge to get it going. It's upside down right now, so the bearings really aren't set properly, but it's running very nicely. I don't see any big issues with it. It's running full out right now because I don't have the speed control mechanism hooked up on it, but this thing would push against this little clutch plate here and limit the speed on it. So I haven't determined whether I'm going to need a speed control device on this particular build, so I'll set this aside. If I need to bring it into the design, that I will later. Just to have a look at it here, you have this bowl gear that drives the worm, and that drives the spindle. And you can see this thing just by inspection. You can tell that it's running far faster than you would need for a record here. So that's the importance of the speed control device. But for the thing I'm going to build, I'm not sure that I'll really need that. So I put it back on the motor board here for the purposes of the build. I've been tripping over this plywood box here in the shop for about 3 years. I got this out of the dumpster. I think one of the cabinet makers made it for something, and then they threw a couple of them away. So I use them to stand on, but this time I thought this would be great for building my mechanism here. I could use this to hold the motor board, and out the side of it here is where I'll install the crank here eventually. So I'll use the motor board to rough out the mechanism on this thing, and when I get it kind of figured out, then I'll replace the motor board with something a little nicer, and I got to decide what kind of a structure that I want this to be in. On the Victrola, there's a little pin that comes off the side of the spindle, and I believe that is where the platter sits, or this is the drive for the platter. But I dimensioned this, and it's about 360 thousandths. It's a cylinder all the way down. Now the Heinemann that I did in my previous project, this was tapered. On this one I was glad to see that it's actually just a cylinder. And so the pin is about a little less than an inch down. So the first thing I did is just cut a fairly tight-fitting hole in this dowel here, and then that will go over the top of the spindle, and so now I have kind of an axle to drive my mechanism on as I develop it. Hope you'll follow along as I go through the build. And there it goes.